So my phone is telling me that it is bang on 5 o'clock, so I think we'll get started here. Bujati Gamaroa, and welcome to today's webinar and book launch of Memory in the Mekong, published by TC Press. My name is Matthew Thomas, and I'm a senior lecturer in comparative education and sociology of education at the University of Sydney. And along with Dr. Alexandra McCormick and Yao Tong Chia, I'm a co-convener of the Sydney Comparative and International Education Research Community of the Sydney School of Education and Social Work, one of today's co-sponsors of the event. And I'd specifically like to acknowledge Dr. Yao Tong Chia for his excellent efforts in organizing and coordinating today's event, as well as the Sydney Southeast Asia Center at the University of Sydney, colloquially known as SEAC, and its staff for all of their support, sponsorship, and particularly advertising of today's webinar. Thirdly, I would also like to thank the History and Education SIG of the Australian Association for Research and Education, the third co-sponsor of today's event. Perhaps most importantly, though, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am zooming from today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and it's upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. So I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging as we come together to discuss these important ideas and share our knowledge practices. May we also remember the knowledge embedded in custodianship of country. And thinking about notions of land and culture and identity and history and citizenship are actually directly relevant to today's talk. And we'll hear more about that as we continue learning from our guest speaker, Dr. Will Brem. Will is an associate professor of education and international development at the Institute of Education, University College London, and a member of the Center for Education and International Development. He is also an adjunct researcher at the Waseda Institute for Advanced Study, Waseda University in Tokyo, Japan, and an honorary adjunct professor at the Royal University of Phnom Penh in Cambodia. And I have a feeling we may be hearing more about Cambodia later in today's session. Dr. Brem's books include Public Policy Innovation for Human Capital Development with Yuto Kitamura, published in 2020, as well as Cambodia for Sale, published by Routledge in 2021, and today's focus, Memory in the Mekong, also co-edited with Yuto Kitamura, published by Teachers College Press in 2022. Will is also the host of Fresh Ed, a very popular podcast in comparative and international education, which has now been downloaded over 500,000 times by listeners in over 180 countries. And on a related note, we will actually be recording today's webinar as an episode of Fresh Ed. So rather than running through a standard PowerPoint slideshow, I will actually ask Will a series of questions about his book and related concepts, and we'll engage in a moderated discussion together. So following this discussion, we will also have a time for questions and answers, though these will not be included in the episode of Fresh Ed. So if you're nervous about wording your question perfectly, do not worry about that. Please feel free. We'd really like to hear from you. You can put any questions that you may have in the Q&A box of the webinar, and I would also encourage you to write them down as you're listening to the presentation so that you don't forget them. Finally, you're welcome to tweet today's event using the hashtag Memory in the Mekong. And I would also encourage you to perhaps tag Will or SEAC and or CoinEd, Sydney CoinEd, so that we're certain not to miss your tweets. You can find all of those on Twitter. I imagine you're probably following us already. If you're not, why not give us a follow? So with all of those housekeeping pieces out of the way, Will Brem, welcome to Fresh Ed.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It is such a pleasure to be talking with you, having this event organized by so many different organizations, to feel connected to Australia once again. It's just absolutely wonderful to be here. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. And such a pleasure. I mean, globalization is derided so often in scholarship, but of course the technology affords us to be having this conversation across the world today. So really excited to have you with us. This new book is really exciting, and it focuses a lot on UNESCO's Shared Histories project. Can you start by just telling us what is this project and how did you become interested in it?
Sure. Yeah. So this book, I'm going to hold it up for the audience that's on the Zoom call that can see the book. This book really began when I was finishing up my previous book on Cambodia, and I was working in Cambodia and realizing that the sort of region was really becoming part of the conversation inside the education sector. And so at that time, in about 2015, this was the 2015 point, when the economic community of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations formed at the end of 2015. And so there was a lot of conversation about a region being built within Southeast Asia. And I was quite interested to understand what did that mean in terms of education. And so I started looking around at different projects in different countries and what they were doing in terms of sort of an ASEAN identity, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations identity, or a regional identity, just trying to think about how this might intersect with education. And there was very few projects actually that existed that were supporting any notion of a regional identity. The closest I got was the Asian Development Bank had a project called Made in ASEAN, which was about promoting sort of production within the ASEAN region. But I did come across a project that was just beginning or had just begun out of UNESCO Bangkok. And it was called Promoting Intercultural Dialogue and a Culture of Peace in Southeast Asia, or what we call the Shared Histories Project. And histories is important. It's plural. It's not a singular history that UNESCO was talking about. But the practicalities of it were UNESCO Bangkok was running a program to basically design curricular materials that could then be implemented within member states if they so choose. And this project was put together from 2013 until 2020. I followed it basically from 2015 until 2020. It was put together by the culture unit within UNESCO Bangkok, which I find also fascinating. It wasn't put together out of the education unit. It was funded by the South Korean government, which is also potentially an interesting insight as to why South Korea might be interested in funding such a project. And it ultimately created 4 units of about 25 lessons. And then at this point, individual countries are deciding if they should implement any of these units or not. And if so, it's going to be sort of localized in a sense when it actually gets put into different curricula. So that's the general idea of what this Shared Histories project is.
Mm. So this, my understanding from reading the book, is this actually was not the first time that UNESCO engaged in a project of this nature, although obviously there are particularities of the Shared Histories project that you're talking about. Can you tell us a little bit more about the history of UNESCO being involved in this type of work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes all the way back to the very founding of UNESCO. The very founding of UNESCO, they were focused on this idea of common heritage, and in fact, they started a project pretty early on. This is sort of the mid to late 1940s, called A History of Humanity, trying to write, a global history of humans.
Sounds sounds impossible.
It is in many ways. It is, and it quickly was contested, and people started to disagree with the very notion that you could sort of write one general history,
Mm.
and particularly in this sort of post-colonial period from the 60s and 70s onwards, there was real sort of pushback against this notion that there's some global history that's being written, of course, sort of in the West, and with Western methodologies. And so what ended up happening is in 1964, a regional history started, or a movement towards regional history within UNESCO started. And they started with the focus of what was called the General History of Africa in 1964. And what UNESCO did at this point was bring together historians across Africa to try and construct, a general shared histories of Africa. And it was very academic. It was academic history, primary sources. They spent about 50 years putting this project together ended up being 8 different volumes that they published, very, rich in academic sort of historical traditions. And it was only in 2009 that UNESCO said, okay, it's great we have these, really valuable history textbooks. And there's lots of debates about how, they sort of privilege certain countries over others within the African continent. But in 2009, UNESCO started thinking, or maybe a little bit before, but in 2009, a new project started that was trying to take these 8 volumes and put them into schools, because you couldn't just take these really dense history texts and just drop them into school curricula. So they created a project to actually design curricula and lessons and units that are based on this general history of Africa project. UNESCO Bangkok, at the same time was thinking, well, we don't want to wait 50 years before we start, impacting education and school curricula. So they actually decided to start directly with the school curricula and sort of forego bringing together all of these historians, which of course would create debate. It's sort of what the academic community does. And so UNESCO tried to not wait that long and sort of, turbocharge the project directly into schools.
Mm. So interesting. I mean, as you specifically used the word histories, plural, earlier. And so it's interesting to think about the notion of shared histories, whether we're talking about the ASEAN region or Africa. And this tension with this idea of global symmetry, which is something that you also talk about in the book as well. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that particular tension between a global symmetry where decisions are being made that are seemingly universal, on one hand, and on the other hand, histories that are plural? How did that look like? What are those tensions to draw out there?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So global symmetry is really the focus on these regional and global level meetings and events that take place quite regularly, that bring together member states. And in many ways is a way of building consensus, sharing ideas, in the hopes that these member states will then go and implement some of these ideas in their home countries. Sovereignty is still defined at the national level or the nation state level. So global symmetry is a way for these regional and global actors and institutions to sort of influence the national polity and policy. And so what's interesting, with this UNESCO Shared Histories project is UNESCO held countless meetings with different members of the nation of the 11 nation states within ASEAN, brought them together, worked on this shared history curricula. They brought in international curriculum experts. They brought in historical experts, and they sort of went through a multi-year process of building and designing shared histories. But a lot of the shared histories, of course, is built on tension. Some of the tension between the present day Thailand and present day Cambodia. Historically, there were big tensions in terms of the different kingdoms that existed in the Southeast Asian region. And so UNESCO was trying very hard to focus on the similarities and sort of forego and push to the side the differences. But of course, there was a bit of competition going on among the different member states trying to jockey for their particular version of national memory and the myths that sort of justify the current elites in the different governments. So for instance, Cambodia was very keen on getting Angkor Wat and the architecture of particular Buddhist pagodas that can be found in more parts of the region as well, not just Cambodia. And they were talking about how that should be included in the shared histories. But the power dynamics within these UNESCO Bangkok meetings were such that the Cambodians were a bit more marginalized than, say, the Indonesian delegations that had particular historical experts on the sort of the hired by UNESCO Bangkok to design this curriculum. And so Angkor Wat and a lot of the architecture was sort of excluded from the final product, much to the, the Cambodian delegation being quite upset. So it was interesting tensions that sort of emerged within that process of global symmetry.
Hmm. So maybe building on those ideas, what does a regional identity look like? Is it possible to have shared histories across this very diverse region and groups of people and cultures, histories?
It's I mean, yes, of course it is, and there are shared histories, right? This is a group of nation states that is quite new, and so historically it was mostly kingdoms, and these kingdoms changed in geographic shapes and sizes over time. There was lots of migration historically, so yes, there is quite a lot of shared histories. How it intersects with the nation state and national history, that's sort of the tension we were primarily interested in. But this notion of what is a regional identity is I think for us it's not simply a geographic sort of notion. It's not static. It's not simply based on the institutions that might exist like ASEAN. It is more it's more socially constructed. It's a process. It's regionalization or regionalism. It's this idea that you actually have to socially construct the idea of a region that has to then be shared by the elites and regular people across this area, and not necessarily defined by external agents like ASEAN sort of traditionally was in that Cold War period by the sort of Western bloc, the US bloc of power in this Cold War moment, using ASEAN to further its own interests across the globe. So yes, that's the history of ASEAN, sure, but I don't think ASEAN necessarily defines what a regional identity is in the country or in the region. And so in other words, regional identity in Southeast Asia is sort of a process of becoming, and the process of socialization that's taking place is ongoing and has looked differently in different times. And so we're just very interested in this moment where, a regional institution is trying to develop curricular materials that will somehow shape identity patterns across the region. It's quite a fascinating moment when it comes to regional identity making in this particular part of the world. Now, is it going to be successful? I don't know. Are there a lot of tensions? Of course. It's just, it's an interesting way to document this process of how the idea of a region is even being constructed.
Mm, so interesting. And I mean, I grew up in the United States, and so if I'm really honest, I don't think of myself as having a region. And of course, the US would be part of North America and part of a number of other international agreements. But I think maybe that's my own cultural myopia in terms of thinking about a region. And yet I know in some other regions, there's a much stronger affinity to a sense of regionalism. And I think that's really interesting just to think about the newness of some of the nation states that you were talking about, and certainly the complexity of the histories and cultures that are merged together. You mentioned briefly some of the various stakeholders who were involved in these particular meetings, people who were hired to be curriculum designers, there were delegates from all of these countries. Were there other stakeholders as well, in addition to these people who were attending the global summits?
It was country delegations, and so each country could decide how they put together that delegation. In Cambodia, it was a lot of so Cambodia was interesting because they were sort of in parallel going through a process of curricular revision, and so it sort of was a nice synergy for exploring how these shared histories curriculum would be implemented in Cambodia. And so I did follow the Cambodian delegation quite closely. And the Cambodian delegation was history professors in the country, was ministry officials in the country. There were secondary school teachers who taught history that would go to these meetings. And they would, attend all of these different meetings. And then they would also be the group that came back to the country and was tasked by the Ministry of Education to redesign the history curricula. But of course, there were the UNESCO Bangkok staff members who were there, the consultants that they hired. One of them actually wrote for the book. Rose Metro was hired by UNESCO Bangkok. She's an expert in Burmese history, but also is an expert sort of in curriculum teaching. And so she's written a lot of history textbooks that can be used for teachers, how to teach history. So she was sort of an ideal candidate to bring in. And she ended up co-writing a chapter with me in this book. And she reflects on the process that, of her time sort of running a Mandela kingdom was an exercise that they created. And they made all of these sort of government officials and nation state delegations act out a mandala kingdom where there was a scenario in each different delegation. Each person had a different role. Some had more powers than others. And then they had to sort of, negotiate these bags of rice and sort of loyalty in different powers. And it's supposed to reflect the history of Southeast Asia, or at least a particular history of Southeast Asia. And, that was her sort of idea or curricular activity that she created and then implemented and practiced. And now, was that then implemented in different nation states? We don't know. Then there was, the South Korea funded the project, but to my understanding, they weren't necessarily too involved at the time. At the time, the Director General of UNESCO Bangkok was from South Korea. And so I think there was probably a close connection there.
So interesting. Well, I'm always obsessed in terms of thinking about pedagogy, and I think that was one of the issues that came up in Rose's chapter as well, of concerns about whether teachers in these various countries would use the same type of pedagogical approaches, very active applied learning that was a simulation in this case of the Mandala Kingdom. Can you say more about the role of pedagogy and whether that was a concern in terms of these kind of, let's say, external creation of lesson plans and units to be taught?
So, I mean, at the regional level, yes, they talked about it. And I think Rose, that story of Rose sort of designing this particular activity and then getting all these different sort of high level delegations to act out. And in fact, it sort of worked. I mean, there was some members of the delegation sort of running far away in the physical room to sort of distance themselves from the kings that existed, who, more in the center, who were able to extract tribute a bit easier. And that is probably what happened. I mean, James Scott wrote a whole book about the art of not being governed. And, the way you're not governed is actually by giving distance to the center powers. And so in a way, it was a really great activity. Now, is this actually going to be implemented back in some of these countries? And that's an interesting question, because, I think for UNESCO Bangkok, the idea here was that these types of activities are to create a historical mindset, being critical when you think about history. And it's not only in these sort of activities which, sort of bring history to life, so to speak, but it's also changing the way in which you teach history, from thinking of it more chronologically, which is traditionally how history is taught, to thinking about it more thematically. So the 4 lessons or the 4 units that UNESCO came up with are themed. And then within each theme, it sort of cuts across history, looks at contemporary issues, looks at prehistory, etc. So that's what UNESCO was thinking about pedagogically. Now, there are some tensions when you think about it trying to be implemented back into national states. The idea of creating a historical mindset in students to allow them to be critical can actually cause some states problems. So in Cambodia, if you get students to think a bit more critically and engage in some topics that the current government does not want discussed. And all of a sudden, you're sort of embracing students to sort of think critically about those topics. The government itself in Cambodia might think twice about embracing those sort of pedagogies that are trying to live up to that intention of a historical mindset that's critical. And so I think there's these tensions, and in Cambodia it played out very clearly. One example is there was a program called the K5 program, where it conscripted citizens more or less into the military to clear forest in the 1980s. So the Vietnamese army, which was supporting the Cambodian army, could sort of move north and attack the Khmer Rouge, which was still in existence at that time, even though not in power. And the K5 plan ended up, killing a lot of Cambodians because of the landmines that were spread out in the jungle as they were clear cutting it, but also with malaria and starvation, overwork. It was just this, pretty awful moment for everyday Cambodians. And a lot of people remember this in Cambodia, sort of at the public level. But it's a topic that cannot be discussed in the national curriculum. And that's because it's sort of, the government in power at that time is still the government in power today. And in many ways, they, have escaped blame for the mass tragedy of the K5 and would rather focus on how terrible the Khmer Rouge was, which it was, but they want to sort of gloss over this other moment in the 1980s. And so the Cambodian government is very clear that they don't want the K5 taught. And the curriculum designers were also very careful not to sort of wade into that controversy. And so they had to be very cautious with what they included or excluded inside the curriculum in the end, which then might sort of go against creating such a historical mindset that UNESCO wanted to create to begin with.
Wow. So there's a potential for counterproductivity in terms of UNESCO's goals vis-a-vis the national curriculum that actually gets implemented, perhaps drawing on some of those lessons that were actually part of the Shared Histories project.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
So interesting. And I imagine for those curriculum developers or the designers, I mean, they're caught in the tension as well, potentially, of the conversations that are being had at these curriculum design sessions at the global summits on one hand, and of course on the other, trying to reconcile their own national curriculum.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think these, what I called mid-level bureaucrats, I think they're essential to understand. They're doing the translation basically between all of this global symmetry and the national elite sort of discourse that the prime minister in Cambodia's case really wants to emphasize. And these mid-level bureaucrats sitting on this committee designing these new curriculum standards and textbooks, they're the ones that are trying to balance. And I used James Scott's notion of cautious resistance and calculated conformity to sort of make sense of that balance. Because many of these curricular developers that I met in Cambodia, these mid-level bureaucrats who worked for the Ministry of Education, they really were quite critical of, some of the historical analysis in Cambodia. They wanted to talk about the K5. They also there was another sort of story about the color revolution, that the Cambodian government really wanted to emphasize this narrative of the color revolution, being that there are sort of external actors working in Cambodia to overthrow the government, and they're often working through the opposition party. And it just so happens that Kem Sokha, who's the opposition leader who was jailed for treason, more or less, the incident that they usually point to, the government usually points to, is his time in Australia giving a talk. And that's on YouTube. And, it's really sort of surreal. But this notion of color revolution was really important to the high levels of government. And so the mid-level bureaucrats had a lot of pressure to conform to that, to include notions of the color revolution. And so the way they balanced this, the mid-level bureaucrats, was they did include the color revolution, but it was all about color revolutions in other countries, not Cambodia. So they could point, if the prime minister of Cambodia said, is the color revolution in the new curriculum? The mid-level bureaucrats can say, yes, it is. But the sort of resistance is that it's not the exact color revolution that maybe the minister or the prime minister once included. So it's a really fascinating balance. And I think, we should probably spend more time looking at these people in the middle, trying to balance all of these elite opinions and also public opinion and public memories that do exist, that of course these curriculum designers also experience and have in their mind, and they're trying to balance all of these different competing interests inside the curriculum, which makes it such a fascinating thing to study.
Mm. Oh, so, yeah, so fascinating. And I know our time is somewhat limited today, but I mean, to be honest, I could keep going on for another hour and a half just because I have so many questions and so many things I want to ask. But you publicly posted on Twitter that I'm going to ask you some tough questions. So I'm going to ask you the toughest that I have on my list here. And that is that, having now completed this project, how do you see the relationship between history and identity, regionally, nationally, or otherwise?
I think it's hugely important. I think, I think identity it's so multifaceted. People wear multiple hats. Sometimes it's contradictory, and it changes. And I think history or historiography, the way we study history, that is often used to justify whatever identity it is. And so I think how we study the histories of Southeast Asia are changing. And I think this UNESCO project is one example of a particular way of understanding the history of Southeast Asia for, particular interests, for a particular vision of the future. Will it happen exactly as UNESCO hopes? Probably not. It gets reinterpreted inside these nations. But I guess, if I think about things that are hopeful, when we worked in Laos, and we wanted to understand identity patterns in Laos, which is a really great place to do so because it is such a diverse country. There are so many different ethnic groups across Laos. And when we went to 2 different provinces and surveyed students and teachers and principals, what we ended up finding is that, sort of as expected, most people identify as a community, as an imagined community, very locally. People in my village, people in my sort of, commune. I might not know everyone in those areas, but I can identify with those people. And I very much so identify with those people. After that, after you get outside of the village, the identity sort of perceptions of how close one feels with others, in Laos, it's the same. People feel as close to everyone else in Laos as they do with everyone else in Southeast Asia. And I think that's quite fascinating because that would actually suggest that some sort of regional identity at the very local level and at the everyday level is possible in a way. And it's very different than just unity and diversity, as the ASEAN organization often says. This is, to me, it's sort of like the nation states are so young, particularly in the Mekong, that actually might allow for the combination of national and regional identity to sort of coexist. I think it is possible. And of course, it would rely on history and memory and identity. It's in process, I would say. So it's to be determined, which means there's a lot more research that needs to be done across the region. And this book we worked on was only in the Mekong. Of course, there's the island nations of Southeast Asia, which introduce a whole new level of complexity that needs to be thought through.
Complexity in terms of the sense of identity and regionally, nationally as well, but even in terms of the internal dynamics of creating the curriculum. Is that right?
I would imagine. I don't know as much about the island nations, but certainly there's going to be domestic sort of particularities, but there'll also be different histories of colonialism, of sort of, in a place like Indonesia, where there's hundreds of language spoken, there's hundreds of islands. Each of these places are going to be quite unique, and how they intersect and work together is quite a fascinating national story. But how do you then connect it to all the other nation states in the country and sort of get to some larger phenomenon that is regional in a sense? And that's, to be determined, I think.
Hmm. I'll pause briefly just to give a plug for the Q&A. I see a couple of questions have already been populated in there, but we would love to hear from you and have an opportunity for you to ask a question to Will, particularly if you're from one of these countries or have spent time in one of the countries in the Mekong or in ASEAN. We would love to hear a question from you specifically. Will, you've talked a little bit about this, but I'm just wondering if there are any lessons that can be drawn from this exercise by UNESCO, or even perhaps your research. And curriculum can always be controversial. I'm thinking about some of the debates that have been happening in the United States, or where I'm located right now in Australia. There was a new curriculum that just came out here in Australia, and a lot of questions about what was included or excluded from that curriculum. Do you have a sense for what we can glean from or learn from this exercise?
So I would say, UNESCO Bangkok went to great lengths to consider this project cultural and not political. They were really, when we asked the different members of UNESCO Bangkok, if this was a political project, they were, it's like, no, of course not. This is not a political project. This is very much a cultural project. It's about bringing people together, working together, and then letting the politics play out at the national level. And I think that that's probably incorrect. I think it is a political project among elites at the regional level that is taking place. And I would suggest embracing that politics, there is ideology there, embracing the ideology, being quite explicit with it. And to me, that will be just a more honest approach to the project itself, rather than trying to minimize this notion of politics and sort of emphasize some of the notions of culture, a very loose term. So I mean, that to me, that's the main lesson from this project. A lot of people ask me, is this project a success or a failure? And I don't know if we can easily sort of categorize it either or. I think it's part of this process of regionalization within this part of the world. And, this project probably, as project cycles go within these big international organizations, they're probably going to be done with it, and there will be these lessons that are publicly available in multiple languages online, and maybe different countries will adopt some of the content in there, which will then have some sort of impact. So in a sense, it is successful, but it might not be successful in the terms that UNESCO set out to begin with.
Super interesting. And as you suggest, it's a dynamic space, right? It will be shifting in the next couple of years. You gave the example of the curriculum from Africa earlier. My colleague Alex McCormick at Sydney has done a lot of work of regional work in the Pacific. We think about the European Union and different changes vis-a-vis populism and nationalism. So certainly there's no shortage of things to research or to work on in this space. Do you have a sense for what's next? Are you planning to conduct a follow-up study or anything else related to this?
I would love to. I mean, to me, one of the things that's so fascinating are the sort of groups on the margins across Southeast Asia, or the ethnic minorities. And I think this is very much influenced by James Scott's notion of the art of not being governed. If I highly recommend everyone read that book if you're interested in Southeast Asia. But I think it would be very interesting to try and understand some of these patterns at the extremes, as far away from the nation state as you can. I mean, what we focused on was the heart of the nation state. We looked at national governments, national delegations working in institutions that bring together nation states. But we know the region is filled with people who live on the edges, who live, in the shatter zones, as James Scotts would call it. And I want to know what's happening there across the region, because there actually might be notions of shared identity and shared histories in those spaces that are on the complete margins or of the nation state. And I think that would be a fascinating follow-up study to this one. But of course, I also think there needs to be a lot more work looking at national curricula, since schooling is such a state project. It would be really fascinating to understand what's happening in more than just the Mekong countries, across the island countries as well, would be a really fascinating topic. So if there's any PhD students out there or future PhD students out there, there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, there you go. So lots more to be researched, but also for today's session, lots more to be discussed as well. So we have a number of questions coming in. I'll just go through some of those that have
Sure.
come up that I think are quite relevant to our discussion. But maybe before we do that, Will, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing these insights. It's a fascinating read. I would encourage everyone to pick up a copy, or if you're on a tight budget, ask your university library, if you have one, to buy a copy and see if you can get it out there. But really, really interesting conversation through all of the chapters. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Matthew. It's really a pleasure to be here with you, and then also on Fresh Ed.
Yeah, that's right. So our first question, I think, is a really difficult but interesting one, thinking about the role of historical revisionism, and what does that look like when it's actually the government itself that's involved in that process, and how might that relate to UNESCO as a global
Mm.
organization that is not necessarily part of the national system, but kind of rides above it?
Mm. So it's a really, really great question. We did a whole chapter on Thailand, which has a very long history of sort of revisionism and different people who live in and outside of Thailand writing very critical histories of the country, which don't necessarily align with the national government's sort of version of history. Um, and in fact, we use quite a lot of work from Tong Chai in our book, and he writes the foreword to the book as well. And in the Thai case, what we found so fascinating is that because there's such a large amount of critical history in Thailand, it's very hard for the government to not acknowledge it, right? It's such an absence if you were to just say it doesn't exist, and we're just going to stick with this national history as we want to define it. And so when we analyzed the current, one of the more recent Thai history textbooks, what we realized is that there was quite an interesting strategy going on. The government textbook would acknowledge that these different histories exist, different sort of writings of history, critical histories exist of different aspects of the Thai nation state, the imagined community that Thailand was trying to construct. And what the government would do, or the textbook would do, would be to position this sort of alternative history as being the wrong choice for students to make. So then the questions that the textbook asks, it's sort of implied like the correct answer is actually the government's version of history. And so we sort of talked about it in terms of manufactured consent. So by acknowledging all of these alternatives, but then still leading children and students to, approve the national history and think that's the correct approach, in a way manufactures this consent towards that national history. And so I think it's a really, really fascinating topic to explore in more depth. Of course, other countries have other critical histories. We focused in on it in the Thai case. How then does it work out in UNESCO? I think that's a bit trickier to tell. I'm sure if you probably could do a very close read of these 25 lessons and sort of bring out the different alternative histories that they might be linking to. So I think there's a lot more work that you could study in that regard. We haven't done that necessarily. We were more interested in the project itself and how it was created.
Maybe just a very specific follow-up question, but are these lessons publicly available on the UNESCO website?
Yes, they are. 25 lessons, 4 units, all available, I think in multiple languages as well.
Yeah, right. So definitely check it out if you're interested in reading more,
Mm.
or as Will said, perhaps doing a study. I mean, probably multiple PhDs could be done on these different
Mm.
sets of curricula, which would be really amazing. I'm going to go to another question, and please keep your questions coming. Unfortunately, we're not able to have you all answer or ask them live, but if you type them in the box, I'll try to get to as many as possible. So a question here goes back to the history of UNESCO that you briefly addressed earlier, Will. So thinking about the history of UNESCO going back to the 40s and then fast forwarding to your project, is this shared histories project an exercise in rewriting history and trying to create collective memories to contribute to world peace or broader objectives for regional harmony? I think the essence of the question is this any different than more nationalist attempts to create a national historical narrative? But in this case, it's just at the global level or at the regional level.
I really do think this UNESCO Bangkok project is certainly connected to UNESCO's larger mission of thinking about sort of peace and global humanity. The the charter of UNESCO starts with, since wars begin in the minds of men, it's in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. And in many ways, this project is part and parcel of that original goal of UNESCO. And so when you talk to the UNESCO Bangkok staff members, they were very clear that this is not an ASEAN project, full stop, right? It wasn't created in conjunction with ASEAN. They would even say that it's not part of creating a regional identity, right? They say that we're not actually working towards those goals. We're working towards creating peace and mutual harmony within this region, which will help towards this global agenda. It just so happens that in my read, it just so happens that it dovetails quite nicely with what ASEAN is also trying to do. But I think it is good to make that point quite explicit.
Hmm. There is a question here actually about the role of ASEAN. Can you say more about that? Is there, how would the project have looked different if ASEAN was more integrally involved?
It's a good question. So ASEAN, um, as a member state organization, has been embarking on what they call the ASEAN community for quite a number of years. And there's 3 different pillars. One is about security, one is about economics. And the economics one was the one that started when I was sort of finishing my other study on Cambodia. And in the economic sense, it's about allowing sort of visa-free travel between countries, lower tariffs for trade. There's not a common currency in Southeast Asia, but it's sort of in the similar vein of the EU in that sense, where it's about sort of trade and movement of people, being able to work in another country or study in another country without needing visas. The last one is the one that I was most fascinated with. It's called the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community. And this one was about sort of focusing on human development and social welfare, social justice, human rights, but they also have this big notion of ASEAN identity. Now, this pillar isn't supposed to sort of come into effect until 2025, but you can see already ASEAN trying to do lots of things. They have logo designs and anthems that they're trying to create. They're trying to construct some sort of interconnections among the people of ASEAN or within the region. And in many ways, I see this UNESCO Bangkok project as part of building out the ASEAN identity, because the ASEAN identity at the ASEAN level has not been articulated in any clear sense, right? It's been undefined and remains undefined, and maybe it always will have to be undefined given the realities of regionalism. But I do think UNESCO Bangkok's project, even if not intended to do so, is contributing to this goal.
That's maybe a good segue to another question from one of our attendees about the role of the project and the potential for either reducing or increasing some form of conflict. And so, the title that you gave earlier includes the word intercultural. So presumably there's some type of intercultural benefit. Can you comment on whether this has the potential to prevent or lead to further conflict?
That's a difficult question. So, I mean, on the one hand, I think global symmetry activities help in not having conflict, right? Allowing different member states to more space to talk and communicate and interact builds consensus. And, in many ways, that's quote unquote the ASEAN way is to build consensus slowly in a way. But I also think that the choice or the choices that were made about what is discussed, what is seen as a shared history, can cause sort of tension among member states. So I talked about the Angkor Wat and the particular architecture of Buddhist pagodas previously. But there's also, interestingly, one of the units that UNESCO Bangkok created was called Rice and Spices. And the idea is that, and I think this is sort of this, you see it quite frequently. If you focus on food, it's somehow not controversial, right? It's not political. It's we can celebrate the differences and similarities in the food that we have across this region. And that's what UNESCO ends up doing. UNESCO Bangkok ends up doing with this particular unit. But of course, when you study food, there's so many tensions that exists. I think in Singapore, there was something called the curry wars, right? So there are lots of ethnic sort of tension that exists between what food we should celebrate as national or regional, etc. And so I think on the one hand, back to the beginning, I think on the one hand, UNESCO Bangkok is creating an atmosphere of working together, which will contribute to, some sort of intercultural dialogue. But I think inevitably they're going to sort of step in areas that create tension among member states, even if it doesn't come out in those global summit meetings. So, for instance, at the big meetings, it was very rare for people to have the public disagreements. But when you get back into your little national groups, it was very apparent that there was a lot of, people being upset about what was said at the sort of more plenary sessions.
So a politeness that played out in the large group sessions that actually belied some frustration under the surface. Is that
very well put? Yes, I think that is exactly what's happening.
Yeah, right. So interesting. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative here and ask you a question that I want to ask. I mean, how have people from UNESCO Bangkok read your book, or other staff members that you've been in touch with? In other words, how is this project received? How has it been received?
I haven't talked to too many UNESCO Bangkok staff members at this point. We did share with them a draft of the chapter that Rose and I met. And, there was, they sort of liked it, but they, said there were certain areas they disliked. I think that this focus on politics is something that they were a bit more skeptical about. Maybe we emphasized it a bit too much. I'm not sure. But I should say that the current UNESCO Bangkok director wrote the afterword for our book. So he's read it, and, I think they probably don't agree with everything we say, but I think in many ways, by highlighting the project, by highlighting these issues, we are also, in a sense, working towards some of the same goals that UNESCO Bangkok wants to work towards. So it's a strange book because it's not written for an organization, but it's also slightly in line with an organization in a weird way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, on a personal level, I just found some of the sections in the various chapters about these interpersonal dynamics that were taking place at the meetings just endlessly fascinating in terms of not wanting to, because there's of course on some level these delegates are representing their country and they're participating in this global UNESCO exercise. and wanting to play nice with other delegates, but also maybe not agreeing with everything that's taking place, and having that flexibility to then go home and kind of rework it for their own national
Mm.
agenda. I thought it was really interesting in terms of how that came out in the chapters. One of the other things that I was reminded of in one of the chapters, thinking about the role of the nation state, and you've touched on this earlier, but the fact that because we're talking about history, history could be yesterday, or it could be 100 years ago, or it could be 1,000 years ago, and how people identify as a citizen of a particular country really depends on how we draw those boundaries of the countries. Can you say a little bit more about that role of boundaries and citizenship and national identity?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in with national identity, the starting point is Benedict Anderson and about imagined communities and how nation states are socially constructed, with the use of schools and museums and censuses, as he talks about, to try and construct an elite version of whatever this imagined community is. And it would mean, for a Cambodian to, although a Cambodian couldn't meet every other Cambodian, they can identify with the idea of what it means to be Cambodian. And there's myths and, all sorts of things sort of come up to help construct what that meaning is. And that meaning can change over time. And I think the Prime Minister of Cambodia has done, he's done a lot to create myths around the Cambodian nation that also sort of cement his place in the politics of the country. But I think, there's a scholar who talks about Cambodia as being an unfinished imagined community. And this goes
Mm.
back to sort of the being a rather young nation state. There's still a lot of competition over what it means to be a Cambodian, or in Laos. It's very difficult to say what a Lao national citizen is. And I think at the elite level, they are still sort of fighting this out. And then, enter the regional identity. And I think it adds even more complexity. And I think what's going to happen is that, the fight over national identity through schools will latch on to particular parts of the UNESCO Bangkok curriculum to justify the national myths that the elite wants to justify. And I think
Mm.
that's definitely happened in Cambodia, and I think it's probably going to happen in other countries. And then these national governments can say to UNESCO Bangkok, yes, we're using your project. Thank you very much. Everyone can be sort of happy in the end, even though it might not have accomplished what UNESCO Bangkok sort of originally wanted to accomplish. It's sort of the limits here. Going back to your question about boundaries, the limit is boundary, right? A regional or an imagined community in Anderson's idea was very much about a political project. And the political project is bounded by these very specific borders of the nation state. Whereas UNESCO Bangkok, a regional imagined community, is the political side of it is slightly different. Sovereignty doesn't rest at the regional level. So UNESCO Bangkok can't demand that any country implements any of these lessons. It has to be up to the sovereign nation state to do so. And that's where the political project, really emerges.
Mm. Fabulous. So interesting. I think, as I said earlier, we could continue forever. But if people do want to continue the conversation with you, Will, how should they get in touch with you?
You find me on Twitter. My email address at UCL. You can always send me a note. I'm pretty available online. I think you can probably find me if you search me. So please get in touch. Happy to answer more questions or talk further about the book, about these ideas. Maybe collaborate with others on the call who are working in similar areas or would like to work in similar areas. I think, Southeast Asia is it's such a fascinating place, given the prehistory, the contemporary politics. Schooling is such a great entry point to think about a lot of these ideas. So I'm keen on continuing to study this area.
Great. Well, I will share the final slide here with a link to the book called Memory in the Mekong, edited by Will, obviously, and Yuto Kitamura, that we've heard so much about today. As I said earlier, it's an excellent read with tons of branches that you could, or different avenues you could go down for future research, or perhaps even using in a course that you're teaching, something like that. Save some money, use the 15% discount if you click on that link, or I'm sure if you track Will down on Twitter, he would be happy to share that as well. But to everyone out there, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your questions and your time. Thank you, Will, for joining Fresh Ed.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It's just
Is it awkward to
such
be
a
on your
pleasure.
own show?
Very awkward.
Well, it's awkward standing in for you as well. But thank you so much, Will, for being our speaker today. Thank you to SEAC for helping to support today's event, to Yaotong Chia and Sydney Coined for helping to coordinate and organize, and to the History and Education SIG of AARE. We thank you so much. We hope you will tune into future webinars for History and Education, SIG, CoinEd, SEAC, all of the other things that are happening. And once again, thank you so much to Will, and we look forward to staying in touch with you.